In the dark depths of this October night, a mysterious melody will forever change the existence of those who dare to listen until the end. This story you are about to discover might well haunt you long after hearing the last words of this terrifying tale. Prepare to dive into a musical nightmare where reality shifts into pure horror. Thomas Mercier was a talented composer who had been living for 5 years in the artistic district of Montmartre. A small apartment under the rooftops housed an upright piano, scattered sheet music, and the permanent echo of melodies in progress. On this night of pounding rain, Thomas was working on his latest composition when he heard something strange. A sweet and hypnotizing melody seemed to filter through the thick walls of his apartment. The notes rose in the night air with a troubling beauty that immediately captivated the musician's attention. Thomas stopped playing and listened carefully, trying to identify the source of this enchanting music. The melodies seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if it emanated from the ancient stones of the building. Without even realizing it, Thomas began to hum these notes that were already imprinting themselves in his memory. The melody was simple, consisting of only 8 measures that repeated in a loop in his captivated mind. Each note seemed perfectly placed, creating a harmony of striking purity that defied all compositional logic. Thomas tried to reproduce the melody on his piano, but his fingers trembled strangely on the ivory keys. The music he had just heard possessed something different, a special quality that surpassed his understanding. The more he tried to forget it, the more the melody persisted in his mind like a growing obsession. Hours passed and Thomas could not close his eyes, haunted by these notes that looped in his head. In the morning, exhausted by this sleepless night, he decided to write down the melody on a score to try to free his mind. But as he wrote the first notes, Thomas realized that his hands were trembling uncontrollably and his vision was blurring. The melody seemed to come alive on paper, the notes dancing before his eyes in a hypnotic choreography. The next morning, Thomas went to his composition class at the Paris Conservatory, where he had been teaching for 3 years. His students immediately noticed his state of fatigue and his strange behavior during the lesson. Without realizing it, Thomas began humming the mysterious melody while explaining the rules of harmony to his students. Margot, a particularly gifted young violinist, was the first to be captivated by these notes she had never heard before. She asked Thomas to repeat this melody that she found absolutely fascinating and of troubling beauty. Without thinking, Thomas began humming again the 8 measures that had obsessed him since the previous night. One by one, the students stopped their conversations to listen to this enchanting melody that filled the room. Mark, a 20-year-old pianist, immediately felt a strange sensation invading him upon hearing these particular notes. The melody seemed to resonate directly in his brain rather than in his ears, creating a troubling vibration. Julie, a lyric singer, unconsciously began to harmonize with Thomas, her voice naturally joining the melody. Within minutes, the entire class was humming this mysterious music in perfect and troubling synchronization. Thomas suddenly realized what was happening and tried to stop this musical contagion that was taking hold of his students. But it was already too late. The melody had infected their minds like a particularly virulent musical virus. The students continued humming even after the class ended, unable to chase these notes from their obsessed thoughts. Dear viewers, if this story already captivates you, don't hesitate to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell, because each subscription gives us the strength to continue offering you terrifying stories of this quality. Don't forget to also check the link in the description to participate in our exclusive contests reserved for members of our community. But let's now return to Thomas and this cursed melody that continues to spread through Paris in the days that followed. The melody began to spread rapidly through the Montmartre district. Margot, the violin student, hummed it mechanically in the Parisian metro during her daily commute. The passengers present in the train car were immediately attracted by these notes of supernatural and disturbing beauty. A businessman in a gray suit began tapping the rhythm on his leather briefcase without even realizing it. A mother found herself rocking her child with this melody she had just heard for the first time. In the span of a single metro ride, 12 People had been contaminated by this parasitic and obsessive music. Mark, the young pianist, unconsciously shared the melody with his student roommates in their 5th arrondissement apartment. That same evening, these 3 young people were humming in loops the 8 cursed measures that had embedded themselves in their brains. Julie, the lyric singer, performed the melody during a choral rehearsal in a Gothic church in central Paris. Within minutes, the 30 choir members had adopted this strange music and were singing it in perfect unison. It's the choir director, man with 60 years of experience, had never felt such a troubling harmony in his entire musical career. The melody seemed to possess a magnetic force that irresistibly attracted all those who heard it even once. Thomas, realizing the extent of the musical contamination he had triggered, desperately tried to find the original source. He returned to his apartment and inspected every dark corner, searching for clues about the origin of this cursed melody. Asterisk. Thomas's research led him to the municipal archives of Paris, where he hoped to find information about his building. He discovered that his building had been constructed on the site of a former psychiatric asylum from the 19th century. The yellowed documents revealed that a mad musician named Édouard Grimbert had been interned there in 1872. Was obsessed with creating a perfect melody capable of uniting all human minds into a single consciousness. He had spent his last years composing tirelessly, carving his notes on the walls of his cell with his bloodied fingernails. The doctors of the time described his behavior as increasingly erratic and dangerous as his compositions progressed. Grimbert claimed to have discovered the secret frequencies that allowed controlling the human mind through music. He died under mysterious circumstances, found in his cell humming a melody that no one had ever heard. Testimonies from the time reported that all those who had heard his last composition had become strangely docile and obedient. Thomas realized with horror that the melody he had heard corresponded exactly to the descriptions in the historical archives. Somehow Grimbert's cursed music had survived time and continued to spread. The mad musician had succeeded in creating a parasitic melody capable of transmitting itself from mind to mind like a musical virus. Thomas understood that he had become the modern vector of this secular contamination that now threatened the entire capital. Meanwhile, in the streets of Paris, the strange effects of the melody began to manifest in infected people. Margot, the violinist, noticed that she was progressively losing her ability to concentrate on her other musical compositions. Only the mysterious melody could still hold her attention in an obsessive and exclusive manner. Mark, the pianist, developed nervous tics consisting of tapping the melody's rhythm on all surfaces he touched. His gestures became increasingly mechanical and repetitive, as if he were programmed by the music itself. Julie, the singer, gradually lost her natural voice and could only perform the 8 cursed measures. All the infected developed a growing aversion to any other form of music or environmental sound. Silence became unbearable to them, and they had to constantly hum the melody to maintain their precarious mental balance. Their social behaviors also began to change in subtle but disturbing ways over the days. Contaminated people showed a tendency to instinctively group together and synchronize their movements without verbal communication. They walked at the same pace, breathed in a coordinated manner, and seemed to share a troubling collective consciousness. Thomas observed these changes with growing terror as he realized the melody was literally transforming human brains. Grimbert's music acted like a mental program that progressively reformatted the victims' personalities. Parisian authorities began receiving disturbing reports concerning strange behaviors in several Parisian arrondissements. Groups of people spontaneously gathered in parks and gardens to hum an unknown melody in unison. These impromptu gatherings created a troubling atmosphere that made non-contaminated passers-by uncomfortable. Police were called several times to disperse these spontaneous choirs that disturbed the usual public order. But the officers who intervened found themselves exposed to the melody and began humming it the next day. The phenomenon thus spread exponentially through law enforcement and municipal services. Dr. Isabelle Moreau, psychiatrist at Saint-Anne Hospital, is the first health professional to identify the viral nature of this musical contamination. Asterisk, she noticed the simultaneous arrival of several patients presenting the same obsessive symptoms related to a particular melody. All described the same enchanting music composed of 8 measures that looped in their minds. Dr. Moreau was careful never to hear this melody directly, communicating with her patients and writing only to avoid contamination. She meticulously documented the evolution of symptoms and observed progressive deterioration of the victim's mental autonomy. Patients lost their cognitive individuality and developed collective thinking centered on the parasitic melody. Dr. Moreau tried to alert health authorities, but her alarming reports were considered fantastical by the medical hierarchy. Thomas, desperate to find a solution, returned to dig through the historical archives, searching for information about Grimbert's death. He discovered in a dusty box the personal journal of the asylum's chief physician, Dr. Auguste Beaumont. The last pages described with precision the terrifying events that had preceded the mad musician's death. Grimbert had managed to contaminate the entire medical staff with his melody during his last night of life. The nurses, guards, and even Dr. Beaumont himself had fallen under the spell of the music, cursed and hypnotizing. They had all gathered in Grimbert's cell, forming a macabre choir that hummed the melody in perfect unison. The mad musician directed this improvised chorus with increasingly frenzied and demented gestures. Dr. Beaumont described the terrifying sensation of losing his free will and becoming a simple instrument serving the melody. The journal's last entry revealed that Grimbert had attempted to carve his melody directly into the stone walls so it would survive his death. Dr. Beaumont had regained consciousness in the morning, finding Grimbert dead in his cell, a blissful smile frozen on his emaciated face. The doctor had immediately ordered the total destruction of the cell and all the deceased's musical writings. But it was evident that the melody had found a way to persist in the very foundations of the building. Thomas understood that the recent renovation of his building had probably freed the melody from its secular stone prison. Armed with this historical information, Thomas decided to return to the foundations of his building to locate the remains of the old cell. He equipped himself with a flashlight and descended into the human cellars. It served as storage for the building's inhabitants. The underground atmosphere was oppressive and charged with unhealthy energy that immediately gave him goosebumps. Thomas noticed traces of ancient graffiti on certain walls, musical symbols carved into the limestone. Following these clues, he discovered a recent partition that had been erected to mask an older part of the foundations. Behind this partition, Thomas found the remains of the old Grimbert cell with its walls covered in carved scores. The parasitic melody was omnipresent on these walls, repeated hundreds of times in different troubling variations. Thomas realized that each breath in this space naturally resonated the notes carved in the porous stone. This was how the melody had escaped during renovation work and contaminated his apartment above. The musician understood that he had to definitively destroy these carvings to stop the spread of the cursed melody. He went back up to get tools and came back down with the firm intention of hammering each note carved in the ancient stone. As soon as he began striking the walls, Thomas heard the melody resonate with tenfold intensity in the confined space. The vibrations of the hammer on stone amplified the cursed frequencies and made them almost unbearable to the ear. Thomas felt his will weaken and his mind sink into the hypnotic trance caused by the omnipotent music. On the surface, in the streets of Paris, the musical epidemic had reached alarming proportions that no one could ignore anymore. Thousands of Parisians now hummed the parasitic melody and all presented the same troubling behavioral symptoms. Public transportation had become hypnotic spaces where travelers sang in unison without ever coordinating. Shops, restaurants, and offices resonated with this obsessive music that disrupted all normal activity in the capital. Media began taking interest in this phenomenon they qualified as large-scale collective hysteria and unexplained. But journalists investigating the subject found themselves contaminated. After hearing the melody during their interviews, Dr. Moreau, who had managed to avoid infection, tried to coordinate an appropriate medical response to this unprecedented health crisis. She proposed establishing quarantine zones to isolate infected people from the rest of the population. But authorities many of whom were already contaminated, rejected her urgent recommendations. Suspicious indifference. Dr. Moreau realized that infected people developed an instinctive resistance to any attempt to treat or isolate them. They seemed to share a collective intelligence that pushed them to protect the spread of the parasitic melody. The infected now lied about their symptoms and hid their condition. To avoid being separated from the contaminated group, Dr. Moreau understood with horror that the melody had created a new form of life, parasitic, that used human brains as support. In the building's foundations, Thomas fought against the hypnotic grip of the melody amplified by the cell's acoustics. He managed to break some superficial carvings before feeling his consciousness wavered dangerously under the music's effect. Thomas realized he could not destroy alone all the musical symbols carved in stone without succumbing to their influence. He rushed back to the surface, panting and trembling after this prolonged exposure to concentrated cursed frequencies. The musician decided to contact Dr. Moreau, whom he had heard about in the media as the only non-contaminated expert of this musical epidemic. He managed to reach her by phone and explained his discovery of the historical origin of the parasitic melody in the foundations. Dr. Moreau was fascinated by these revelations that confirmed her hypotheses about the viral nature of this musical contamination. She proposed meeting Thomas in an isolated place to develop together a strategy for definitive destruction of the source. They arranged to meet in an old abandoned quarry in the Parisian suburbs, far from any population susceptible to contamination. Dr. Moreau brought medical equipment to protect Thomas from the melody's effects while he destroyed the cursed carvings. She had developed a noise-canceling headset equipped with white noise generators to mask parasitic frequencies. Thomas accepted this protection, aware that this was his last chance to stop the epidemic before it became uncontrollable. Dr. Moreau also injected him with a cocktail of light sedatives to reduce his sensitivity to the music's hypnotic effects. Equipped with these medical protections, Thomas descended into the cursed foundations with renewed and fierce determination. The noise-canceling headset considerably attenuated the melody's effect, allowing him to keep his lucidity despite direct exposure. He began methodically hammering each carving visible on the walls of Grimbert's former cell. Hammer blow made the stone resonate, but the headset's white noise effectively masked the dangerous frequencies. Thomas worked with surgical precision to definitively erase all traces of the parasitic melody from the ancient walls. Intense effort. He had succeeded in destroying the majority of the scores carved in the limestone. But suddenly, Thomas discovered a deeper carving hidden behind a rocky projection in the back of the cell. This score seemed to be the complete original of Grimbert's melody, carved with extraordinary care and precision. Thomas realized this was the very heart of the musical virus, the primary source of all Parisian contamination. He raised his hammer to strike this crucial carving, but suddenly felt a strange resistance in his movements. The air around this particular score seemed to vibrate with energy and create an invisible barrier protecting the cursed notes. Thomas increased the power of his blows, but each impact on stone released overpowering harmonics that pierced through his headset. The sedatives were no longer enough to protect him from the direct influence of the melody in its purest and most concentrated form. On the surface, Dr. Moreau anxiously monitored Thomas's vital signs through a medical monitor. She noticed a disturbing acceleration, his heart rate and brain waves indicating dangerous exposure. Dr. Moreau tried to communicate with Thomas by radio, but only got strange static that resembled fragments of the melody. She realized Thomas was in mortal danger and that she had to intervene quickly to save him from total domination. Dr. Moreau descended into the foundations equipped with her own protective headset and a complete emergency medical arsenal. She found Thomas motionless before the main carving, his hammer fallen at his feet and his eyes rolled back in trance. The musician was humming the melody with supernatural intensity that made the surrounding air vibrate visibly. Dr. Moreau injected him with a powerful antipsychotic to try to break the hypnotic grip of music on his brain. Thomas collapsed to the ground, convulsing violently while his mind fought between consciousness and musical obsession. Dr. Moreau took advantage of this. temporary interruption to examine the mysterious carving that had nearly cost Thomas his life. She understood that this score was different from the others. It contained musical elements of terrifying and supernatural complexity. Dr. Moreau realized that Grimbert had succeeded in creating self-replicating melody capable of defending itself against any destruction attempt. The music had become a parasitic life form endowed with primitive but effective intelligence to ensure its survival. While Dr. Moreau treated Thomas, the surface situation continued to deteriorate exponentially. And alarmingly, people infected by the parasitic melody had begun to gather massively in large Parisian public spaces. Place de la Concorde now hosted a giant choir of several thousand voices humming in perfect unison. This massive concentration of infected created a sound field of unprecedented power that spread for several kilometers around. The last non-contaminated Parisians fled the capital en masse to escape this musical pollution that invaded every street. But even kilometers away, the melody carried by wind continued to contaminate populations in surrounding suburbs. National authorities declared a state of emergency and established a security perimeter around the infected Parisian region. The army was mobilized to prevent the spread of what they now qualified as a musical biological weapon of unknown origin. But soldiers posted at roadblocks were quickly contaminated by infected refugees who unconsciously hummed the melody. Musical epidemic thus crossed all military barriers and began extending toward neighboring regions of Ile-de-France. International media began speaking of an unprecedented catastrophe that threatened the mental balance of millions of people. Dr. Moreau and Thomas now represented the last hopes of finding a solution before the epidemic became worldwide. Thomas regained consciousness in Dr. Moreau's arms, who had administered a cocktail of medications to stabilize his condition. The musician described the terrifying experience he had lived by, directly touching the source of the parasitic melody. He explained that Grimbert's music possessed a primitive consciousness that actively defended its own existence and reproduction. Thomas had felt the malevolent will of this musical entity that sought to extend its control over all humanity. Dr. Moreau understood that physical destruction of the carvings would not be enough to definitively eliminate this evolved parasitic life form. They had to find a way to fight the melody on its own terrain, using acoustic laws against itself. Thomas proposed creating an antidote melody that could neutralize parasitic frequencies. Through mathematical destructive interference, Dr. Moreau was skeptical, as this approach required perfect understanding of the neurobiological mechanisms of musical contamination. They decided to return to the surface to analyze brain recordings of infected people and identify precise frequencies Dr. Moreau had stored in her laboratory. Numerous data on the neural activity of melody victims, Almasanchi spent the night analyzing this information to understand how music modified human brainwaves. They discovered that Grimbert's melody exploited specific frequencies that resonated with auditory cortex neurons. This resonance created a hypnotic state that made the brain particularly receptive to behavioral suggestions integrated into the melody. Thomas discovered that Grimbert had encoded instructions directly into the harmonic structure of his cursed and parasitic composition. These subliminal instructions pushed victims to spread the melody and adopt synchronized and troubling collective behaviors. Dr. Moreau realized that each note possessed a precise neurological function in the progressive mental contamination process. The first measure deactivated the brain's natural defenses against external musical intrusions. The second measure implanted the compulsive obsession to repeat and transmit the melody to other vulnerable people. The following measures progressively modified the victim's personality to make them more docile and receptive. Thomas understood he had to create an inverse melody that would cancel each of these specific and dangerous neural instructions. He began feverishly composing this musical antidote, using principles of acoustic interference and mental counterprogramming. Each note of his composition had to precisely neutralize the corresponding effect in Grimbert's melody on the human brain. Dr. Moreau assisted him by verifying that the chosen frequencies corresponded well to the neurobiological data from their detailed analyses. The work was extremely delicate, as an error could worsen contamination instead of curing it. Thomas had to draw on all his musical knowledge to create a harmony capable of freeing minds imprisoned by the melody. While they worked on the antidote, the external situation reached a critical and terrifying point of no return for humanity. The parasitic melody had crossed national borders and began contaminating neighboring European countries of France. Millions of people now hummed this cursed music that transformed Europe into a gigantic, hypnotized and uniformed choir. Governments desperately tried to cut communications to prevent digital spread of the melody via internet. But infected people always found ways to transmit their musical obsession to still healthy and vulnerable populations. Some used light signals to visually encode the melody and contaminate through eyes rather than ears. Others tapped the rhythm in Morse on building pipes, thus spreading the melody through mechanical vibrations. The collective intelligence of the infected constantly developed new strategies to ensure survival and expansion of their musical parasite. Scientists worldwide studied this unprecedented phenomenon they qualified as the first musical pandemic. In human history, some theorized that Grimbert's melody represented a parasitic evolution adapted to the modern era of global communications. Others suggested it was a form of artificial life accidentally created by 19th century musical experiments. Scientific research was, however, hindered by the fact that any researcher exposed to the melody quickly became unusable. Thomas and Dr. Moreau represented the last non-contaminated experts capable of developing an effective solution to this global crisis. After 48 hours of intensive work, Thomas completed his antidote composition that he baptized the Liberating Melody. This 8-measure musical piece was designed to systematically cancel each neurological effect of Grimbert's parasitic melody. Dr. Moreau performed computer simulations to verify that chosen frequencies would indeed produce the expected destructive interference. Calculations indicated a high probability of success in neutralizing the hypnotic effects of the original melody. Thomas and Dr. Moreau decided to test the antidote on a small group of infected people in a controlled environment. They went to a psychiatric hospital in the suburbs where about 20 patients presented symptoms of musical contamination. Thomas performed his liberating melody on piano before these patients who were looping Grimbert's music. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Patients stopped humming and seemed to gradually regain awareness of their environment. Their eyes regained human expression and they began asking questions about what had happened to them. Dr. Moreau confirmed by electroencephalogram that these patients' brain activity had returned to normal after exposure to the antidote. The liberating melody had definitively erased the parasitic melody from their memory without leaving apparent sequelae. Thomas and Dr. Moreau realized they finally held the absolute weapon against the musical epidemic ravaging the entire planet. They now had to diffuse this antidote melody globally to save humanity from Grimbert's grip. Global diffusion of the liberating melody represented a colossal logistical challenge in a world where communications were disrupted. Thomas and Dr. Moreau contacted military authorities who had established a command post outside the contaminated zone. Generals were initially skeptical about this musical solution. They judged too simple to solve such a large-scale crisis. But demonstrations of the antidote's effectiveness on infected soldiers quickly convinced them of this revolutionary approach's utility. The army mobilized all its diffusion means: military radio stations, field loudspeakers, and even aircraft. Equipped with sound systems, the first offensive against the parasitic melody was launched simultaneously from 12 strategic points around infected Paris. Loudspeakers diffused the liberating melody, with maximum sound power to cover the entire Parisian region. The effect was immediately visible. Gigantic gatherings of infected began dispersing spontaneously and naturally. Contaminated Parisians stopped humming, looked around with confusion, then returned home as if waking from a dream. Within hours, the French capital was liberated from Grimbert's melody grip, thanks to Thomas's antidote. The operation was quickly extended to other contaminated French regions, with the same brilliant and encouraging success. European governments reproduced this diffusion strategy in their own territories infected by the musical epidemic. Thomas became overnight the world hero who had saved humanity from an unprecedented parasitic threat in history. But Thomas was not satisfied with this partial victory, as he knew the original source still existed in the foundations. As long as Grimbert's carvings were not destroyed, the risk of new contamination remained permanent and threatening. Thomas returned to the cursed foundations of his building, this time accompanied by a team of experienced military demolition experts. They brought powerful explosives to definitively destroy the old cell, and all scores carved in stone. I played his liberating melody continuously to neutralize the carving's effects, while soldiers installed charges. The explosion that followed was deafening and made the entire building tremble on its secular and fragile foundations. When dust settled, nothing remained of the old Grimbert's cell or its dangerous wall scores. Thomas personally verified that all musical traces had been erased from this cursed place that had nearly destroyed humanity. Acoustic analyses confirmed the total absence of musical resonance in the debris of the destroyed old cell. Grimbert's parasitic melody was definitively eradicated. From Earth's surface, after more than a century of underground existence, Thomas could finally sleep peacefully, knowing humanity was safe from this musical threat for future generations. Dr. Moreau and he were acclaimed by all world governments for their heroic contribution to humanity's salvation. The months following this historic victory were devoted to in-depth scientific study of this unprecedented musical phenomenon. Thomas and Dr. Moreau published their research in the most prestigious international scientific journals. Their work opened a new field of research at the crossroads of musicology, neurology, and modern parasitology. Specialized laboratories were created worldwide to study sound frequency effects on the human brain. Thomas developed an alert system, capable of automatically detecting any melody presenting parasitic characteristics, similar to Grimbert's. This system was installed in all musical diffusion centers to prevent any new accidental or intentional contamination. Dr. Moreau created a standard medical protocol to treat victims of musical manipulation and acoustic conditioning. Together, they trained a new generation of researchers specialized in defense against sonic and musical weapons. Humanity had learned a crucial lesson about potential dangers hidden in the most seemingly harmless artistic creations. Music, this universal art that unites peoples, could also become the most fearsome weapon to enslave minds and control masses. Thomas continued his composer career, but with new awareness of the ethical responsibilities of every musical creator. He never again created a melody without testing it beforehand to ensure it contained no potentially dangerous or manipulative elements. This terrifying adventure had also revealed troubling aspects of human nature and our mind's vulnerability. Thomas realized that each person carried within them a susceptibility to external influences that could be exploited by malevolent spirits. Grimbert's melody had only revealed this universal flaw in the psychic architecture of the entire human species. Dr. Moreau developed mental strengthening techniques to help individuals resist acoustic manipulation attempts. These methods were taught in schools as a new form of civic education adapted to 21st century dangers. Humanity emerged, strengthened from this ordeal, better prepared to face future challenges related to technological and artistic evolution. Thomas became a world symbol of resistance against forces seeking to enslave the human spirit through devious means. His story was taught in universities as a perfect example of the importance of scientific and artistic vigilance. The liberating melody he had composed became an unofficial anthem of mental freedom and intellectual independence. Each year, the entire world commemorated the anniversary of this victory against musical parasitism in joyful and grateful celebration. Thomas and Dr. Moreau continued their scientific collaboration to develop new means of protection against emerging acoustic threats. Their constant vigilance ensured that never again would humanity be caught off guard by a parasitic melody like Grimbert's. But in the forgotten depths of certain musical archives worldwide, other dangerous compositions might be waiting their turn. Melodies created by deranged minds through centuries, stored in dusty manuscripts and abandoned scores. Thomas and Dr. Moreau launched a global program for census and analysis of all potentially dangerous historical musical works. This titanic mission required collaboration of musicologists, historians, psychologists, and neuroscientists from around the world, for they had understood that Grimbert was probably not the only one to have discovered the secrets of musical manipulation of human minds. History was full of troubling examples of music with unexplained effects on collective and individual behaviors of populations. Certain folk melodies were reputed to provoke trances, ecstasies, or compulsive behaviors in their regular listeners. Composers like Paganini or Liszt had been accused of demonic pacts so much their music produced supernatural effects on audiences. Thomas and Dr. Moreau knew it would take decades to identify and neutralize all potential dormant musical threats. But this mission was essential to guarantee humanity never relives the horror of Grimbert's parasitic epidemic. They created an international organization dedicated to surveillance and protection against musical and acoustic weapons. This organization, baptized the World Institute of Sound Security, quickly became an essential reference in this new field. Thomas was named artistic director while Dr. Moore,